Okay. All right, so we were talking about Paul's focus here in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, and we showed how he focused on the positive and that he focused on others, and that's a big one, by the way, and that he focused on the inner man rather than the outer man. And then that, of course, brings us to the next focus, and that is the eternal. So Paul called his affliction light and momentary. And yet, when you think about all the things Paul went through, and again, he talks about these in the latter part of the book in chapter 11. He gives quite a list there of things that he went through. I don't know about you, but if I went through those things, I probably wouldn't call it light, and I probably wouldn't call it momentary. In fact, I'd probably be a little bit upset if somebody else called them light or momentary and say, "Oh, well, that's really not too bad." I would probably be like, "Hold on a minute, this was serious. This was a real problem." And it seems like when things happen to us, why we take them serious. We take them as anything but light and momentary. But our glory is an exceeding weight, and it is eternal. And so he says here, our light affliction, verse 17, which is but for a moment, is working for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. And so, again, the contrast between what's light and what's heavy, and what's momentary and what's eternal. But here's the point. I don't care how much you suffer in this life. It is nothing compared to the suffering of hell. Absolutely nothing. But on the other side of the coin, I don't care how much you suffer in this life. It is nothing compared to the duration of eternity. How foolish to allow the temporary to rob us of the eternal. Somebody called me here just this last week, and they were talking about some decisions that a congregation had to make, and they wanted my advice on it. And one thing I said is, I would want to know enough about the situation to know whether the problem they're dealing with is it something that's temporary in nature. Because I would hate to have to make a decision that has permanent consequences because of temporary circumstances. And if you think about it, that attitude is kind of the heart of what Paul's talking about here, and it's kind of the heart of the Christian attitude that, as Christians, we don't necessarily benefit in this life, at least not in the ways that most people think about. There are certain benefits to being a Christian even in this life, but it's not like if we become a Christian we're going to be healthy all the time or we're going to be wealthy all the time, despite what the radio and TV preachers might say. That's just simply not true. It wasn't true for Paul, and it wasn't true for Peter, and it wasn't true for Timothy, and it wasn't true for all these. And you shouldn't expect it to be true for you. So when we become a Christian, though, we're recognizing that we might even have some suffering to do in this lifetime because of the fact that we're a Christian, but it's worth it because the payoff is eternal. And so, two things. Number one, the payoff, the suffering is temporary, but the payoff's eternal. But secondly, the suffering, it doesn't even begin to compare to the glory that's awaiting us in heaven. But how foolish, because of temporary, because you want to be comfortable in the temporary, or you want to do what's enjoyable or pleasurable in the temporary, to throw away your eternity because of that. When a couple years ago I took grandkids to a state park over in Ohio, and my little granddaughter, we went across this bridge that had this wooden railing, and we went across the bridge, went across this where a creek feeds into a pond, and she was running her hand along that railing, and wouldn't you know it, she got a splinter. And she was 4 years old at the time, and the hard thing is we had to get that splinter out. And we're trying to explain to a 4-year-old that hold still for just a minute. We got to get this splinter out of here. Hard for her to understand that little bit of momentary pain it's going to take for us to get that splinter out of there is going to bring her permanent relief. because it was hurting her to have the splinter in there. And so we could get some permanent relief if we could just, for just a moment, give a little more pain to get that splinter out of there. And it was not an easy task, but we eventually got the job done. The point is that sometimes we don't want to put up with any kind of difficulties or unpleasantness or anything that makes us uncomfortable in the momentary passing moment. And by doing so, being so concerned about that, we forfeit our eternity. And we find ourselves in misery for all eternity. And if you'd left that splinter in there, it would have only gotten worse. It probably would have gotten infected, and who knows how much kind of trouble it could have eventually caused. Now, you can understand a 4-year-old having a difficult time understanding that. But as we mature, we ought to understand that better than ever. The older we get, the more we're like, that's going to hurt to get that out of there. But we also recognize how important it is that we get it out of there, and how once we get it out of there, how much better it's going to feel. And so we're willing to put up with things. And I'm talking in the physical realm, but it's also true in the spiritual realm. The more we mature in Christ, the more we ought to be able to understand that difficulties in the here and now have consequences, positive consequences, for all of eternity. And so Jesus said it this way: what does it profit a man if he gain the whole world and yet lose his own soul? And the answer is, it's not of any profit. It's not of any profit. We have to understand that our soul is in this for all eternity. Our inner man, as Paul calls it here, is in this for all eternity. And a temporary loss of comfort, or whatever it might be, displeasure, all those things, is not worth throwing away our eternity for. So we got to focus on the eternal. So we focus on the inward man, we focus on the eternal, we focus on others, and we focus on the positive. But then finally, and this is really the most important of all, we focus on Jesus. It's really the one that leads to all the others. It's because we're focused on Jesus that we can focus on the positive. It's because we're focused on Jesus that we focus on others. It's because we're focused on Jesus that we focus on the inner man, and that we focus on the eternity. So it's on the eternal, I should say. And so it's our focus on Jesus is kind of the foundation of all these others. When we focus on Jesus, we can focus on these other things. In fact, only Jesus can really enable us to think this way at all. It's only because we have focus on Jesus that we can think about other people instead of ourselves. That we can think about eternal things. That we can think about the inner man. That we can think about the positive. He's what enables us to do that. The atheist, the agnostic, they can't. If you're an atheist or an agnostic, good luck focusing on eternal things. Good luck focusing on the inner man. I mean, after all, this life is all you have. You better enjoy it. And that means physical pleasures and physical comfort and physical, whatever is going to feel good at the moment. Now, there's times when you, as an atheist or agnostic, you might, restrain your behavior in the moment because, like, right now it might feel really good to punch that guy in the nose that's irritating you. But you might not do that because you recognize there are consequences of that that might be more long-term than just a few moments pleasure that you might get out of hitting the guy in the nose. But you certainly can't focus on things in an eternal way because you don't believe that really exists. But as a Christian, not only do we recognize that those things exist, but we recognize that that's what's crucial and that's what counts. And it's our knowledge that this life is not all there is that allows us to focus on all these other things. Now, Paul says he always carried about the dying of the Lord in order to manifest his life, that is the Lord's life, in his body. He says that here he says that in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, he says that he died daily. And he talks here about all these things that abound to our glory. And he said in Galatians chapter 2 and verse 20 that he said that he died with Christ. In other words, he counted himself as though it's not about Paul anymore. It's about Christ. I've died with Christ. And that has a reference, I believe, to his baptism, of course. But he's saying, he counted himself as dead for the sake of Christ. So it's not about what Paul wants. It's about what Christ wants. That's what Paul's talking about here. And that's what we're called to do. We are called to die daily to ourselves so that we can live to Christ and that we can manifest the life of Christ in our bodies and the things that we do. In other words, we make known the Lord. We shine forth His glory is another way to say that. Well, Paul said that he had the same faith as the psalmist. That's really in verse 13 here. And in fact, the verse I was looking for a minute ago in point C there was where I said he says he always cared about the dying of the Lord. That's verse 11, right? That he says that death is working in us, and that he says that we are always delivered to death for Jesus' sake, that the life of Jesus may be manifested in our mortal flesh. That's what he's talking about here. But in verse 13, he says, since we have the same spirit of faith according to what is written, I believed, and therefore I spoke. Now here he's actually quoting from the Psalms. He's quoting, in fact, from Psalms 116 and verse 10. And what Paul is really saying is, he's saying, I share the faith that the psalmist had in Psalms 116. And if you turn to Psalms 116, I want to kind of draw your attention to a couple of things that the psalmist says. Psalms 116, and specifically, I want to look at verses 3 and 4, where he says, the pains of death surround me. The pangs of Sheol, that's death and the grave, lay hold of me. Sometimes Sheol means the realm of the dead. It kind of depends on the context here. But he's saying, the pains of death have surrounded me. The pangs of Sheol laid hold of me. I found trouble and sorrow. Then I called upon the name of the Lord. O Lord, I implore you, deliver my soul. Look down in verses 8 and 9. He says, you have delivered my soul from death, my eyes from tears, and my feet from falling. I will walk before the Lord in the land of the living. And in verse 15 he says, precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his saints. Now it's verse 10 that Paul quotes in 2 Corinthians there, where he says, I believed and therefore I spoke. I am greatly afflicted. Now what is he talking about here? Paul's saying, I got the kind of faith that the psalmist had, that even though the pains of death have surrounded me, and the pangs of Sheol have laid hold of me, and I found trouble, I called on the name of the Lord. I implored you to deliver my soul. Even though, he says, you've delivered my soul from death, my eyes from tears, my feet from falling. I'm going to walk in the land of the living. I believed, and therefore I spoke. In other words, he's expressing his hope that he's going to live despite all these things. And of course, he's talking more than just about his physical life. He's talking about his spiritual life. And Paul's saying he has that same kind of faith, and this is the faith that helps us find our focus, just like it helped Paul to find his focus. Precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his saints. We recognize that this life is not all there is. There's something better. There's something more. There's something greater. And even though all the troubles in this world can come upon us, we have something better waiting for us. And Paul says he knows that God is going to raise us up with Jesus. That's verse 14. Knowing that he who raised up the Lord Jesus will also raise us up with Jesus and will present us with you. So Paul has that confidence. That's what the psalmist says, right? Precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his saints. He believed there was going to be a resurrection. It's at the resurrection of Jesus, it is the resurrection of Jesus that gives us hope for our own resurrection. The reason we can have hope that, someday they're going to put this body in the ground. And the reason we can have hope that there's something beyond that there is going to be a resurrection, is because Jesus rose from the dead. That's why we have that hope. And it is his resurrection that puts this life into perspective. And here, let me tell you something. Let me help you put our life in perspective. Number one, our life is brief. That is this life on this earth. It's brief. It's not eternal. Secondly, it's difficult. And it's not really glorious. The psalmist says it this way in Psalms 95. Let me turn there, actually, and I'll read it to you. In Psalms chapter 95, I use this occasionally at funerals, but he says, I guess it's not Psalms 95 that I wanted here. It's the one where he talks about how long. Yeah, here is Psalms 90. Psalms 90 is the one I want. He says, the days of our lives are 70 years, and if by reason of strength they're 80 years, yet their boast is only labor and sorrow. For it's soon cut off, and we fly away. And so he goes on in verse 12 to say, so teach us to number our days that we may gain a heart of wisdom. And so the point is that our life here is brief, it's not eternal, it's difficult, it's not glorious, and it's constant death. Honestly, the process of aging boils down to every day we die a little bit more. That's what's happening. Every day that I wake up, certainly if I don't wake up, but every day when I wake up, I'm one day closer to death than I was the day before. And my skin on my body is constantly dying and has to be replaced by new skin. The hairs on my head are constantly falling out, have to be replaced by new hair. And our bodies are just constantly running down. And death is all around us constantly. But when we think about the resurrection of Jesus Christ, it puts all that into perspective. We recognize that this is temporary. There's something better waiting for us and something eternal waiting for us. I can't help but think about what the Hebrew writer said in Hebrews chapter 12, beginning in verse 1. Listen to what he had to say. He says, therefore we also, since we're surrounded by so great cloud of witnesses, that's all the heroes of the faith that he mentioned in chapter 11 there, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that's set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of God, of the throne of God. For consider him who endured such hostility from sinners against himself, lest you become weary and discouraged in your souls. You have not yet resisted to bloodshed, striving against sin. Notice that the point here is, he's saying, consider all these witnesses, all these heroes of the faith, and we ought to run our race with endurance, but look unto Jesus. He's the author and finisher of our faith. And consider what he went through for us. And when we focus on Jesus, we can run that race that's set before us. And he says, we've not yet resisted to the point of bloodshed, striving against sin, but Jesus did. He shed his blood for us on the cross. So focusing on Jesus, it puts everything into perspective. And focusing on Jesus will not lose heart. Now you remember when Peter walked on water, not that you were there, I imagine you weren't, but you remember how they're out in the boat and the storm's rising and Jesus comes walking across the water. He comes walking on the water and they see him, and at first they cry out because they think it's a ghost. And Jesus says, no, just, don't fear, it's me. And Peter says, Lord, if it's you, bid me to come out with you. And so Jesus says, come on. And so Peter gets out of the boat and he starts walking towards Jesus. And what does it say? Well, he began to look at the waves and the wind and notice how strong the wind was and how big the waves were. And what happened? He began to sink. You see, when you take your eyes off Jesus and you focus on the problems around you, you start to sink. And if we're not careful, we can do that any given time. We can start to say, you know what, there's all these problems around us. There's all these issues in the world. There's these problems in my ministry. There's problems in my church. There's problems in my family. There's problems in my marriage. There's problems at work. There's problems, and there's a problem with my car. There's a problem with my house. We start to take our eyes off Jesus. Guess what? We're going to sink too, just like Peter did. But when we focus on Jesus, we can be renewed day by day. So I want to just kind of wrap this lesson up by saying focus is important in almost everything we do in life. We can't accomplish anything or succeed in anything if we don't focus on our goals. And the thing that happens, somebody was just talking to me yesterday and talking about how important it is that when life knocks you down, you get back up. Well, and I said, yeah, and everybody gets knocked down in life. And they said to me, rightly so, in fact, we get knocked down over and over and over again. Well, let me tell you something. I guarantee those people, and I've not been watching the Olympics, but I know the Winter Olympics are going on right now. And you think about like the ice skaters. You think those ice skaters ever fell while they're learning to, they're wanting their goal is to get a gold medal in the Olympics. And you know what? If the ice skater goes out there and all they think about is that time they fell, or those multiple times they fell, they're not going to be able to perform, and they're not going to be able to accomplish their goal. In life, if we want to accomplish something, we have to learn to focus on our goals, not on our obstacles. And here's the thing, we can have eternal glory, which is our goal, if we focus on the positive, and we focus on other people, and we focus on the inward man, and we focus on the eternal, and most importantly, we focus on Jesus. Those of you who are taking this for credit, don't forget, your first paper is due next week. And so hopefully we're not going to have any weather trouble next week, and have those papers ready to go. And everybody take care until then, and be safe in the storm.